we're trying to figure out what Kabbalah is. Where does it come from? That's what we're trying to figure out today.
Right, where Kabbalah comes from. So, with your permission, if I can focus, to turn the focus just a bit towards the question of Kabbalah versus Hasidus. I know we're coming out of a group that identifies itself as Hasidic.
And we have to figure out what Hasidus is also.
We know that Kabbalah is looming there in the background, and a lot of the Hasidus, particularly the Hasidus that we learn, Hasidus Chabad, is very overtly Kabbalistic.
Right.
But what the line is, what the definitions are, what the transition or evolution was from Kabbalah to Hasidus isn't necessarily very clear to everyone or to anyone. So maybe this is something we can
definitely
discuss, explore.
Sounds like a plan.
All right.
As long as we figure out, who that Arizal is and all the...
So as I was mentioning to you earlier, even the Arizal, the term most would use to describe the Arizal is a Kabbalist, a Makobel in Hebrew.
Right.
But arguably one could argue that in a certain sense, he also led a group of Hasidim, or a movement of Hasidus, and that there have been many Hasidic movements of Hasidus throughout the generations, and they all have certain commonalities with each other, even if they're not all identical or they emphasize different things. In a certain sense,
Hasidic movement was...
So in a certain sense, there's the modern Hasidic movement that's attributed to the Baal Shem Tov, to the Maggid. So that's from the mid 1700s or so. But in a certain sense, even the practices, even the manner in which Judaism is practiced, right? So Kabbalah, when you say Kabbalah, when you say Kabbalistic, we think more of an intellectual, very certainly in the Hasidic Chabad context, we think of it as very cerebral, intellectual exercise. But Kabbalah has always had a more practical side as well.
Like
and
traditional, cultural...
In terms of how one approaches one's Judaism, how one practices Judaism, with what intentions, or even specific details of how one goes about practicing the same laws, the same commandments, the same mitzvahs that other Jews practice, but going about it in slightly different ways with emphasis on certain details or certain intentions.
So we're trying to figure out really how we get from, the ancient Kabbalistic groups, which were leading a certain lifestyle, to, Hasidic life today.
Right. So there's the intellectual dimension, then there's the lifestyle, there's even the group dynamics. Usually it involves groups that gather together in some form, in some way, and what are the dynamics within those groups. The Arizal led a group. It wasn't just an isolated thing that was taking place.
Was it a group, or was it more like he had his students, his disciples, his followers?
He had a circle. He had a circle of disciples.
More like an inner circle.
But if you look at, take the Arizal, and we're not going chronologically here, but let's say take the Arizal's writings. So the Arizal's writings themselves reached us in many different versions. Often you look for a text of the Arizal and you'll find that it appears in 4 different places with minor variations or sometimes significant variations. But in the Kabbalistic world and the yeshivas that study Kabbalah today, the gold standard, the source they study the Arizal's, Isaac Luria's Kabbalah from, is known as the Shemayna She'arim, the 8 gates. And that's his chief disciple, his main disciple, Rabbi Chaim Vital, who certainly in Kabbalistic circles is considered to be the main channel for disseminating the teachings of the Arizal. So Rabbi Chaim Vital had this lengthy process of writing and rewriting. The Arizal only taught for a year and a half. I don't have the exact, but somewhere in that area. It was not a very long period of time at all. And that somehow changed, revolutionized the face of Judaism. Yeah, so he passed away in his 30s, very young. But he'd been basically an unknown until shortly before. He'd spent many years in Egypt, where his uncle lived.
Do we know what he was doing around there?
So there's the official biography of the Arizal that's called the Shivchei Ha'ari. It's not clear who wrote it, but there's also a shorter version written by Chaim Vital. It seems to track, it seems written in the same order. And there's the backstory of how the Arizal came to be the Arizal. And if you want me to tell the story in short, the story in short goes that it all goes back to the Zohar, which is the previous major Kabbalistic text, and that the Arizal I'd have to look the story up exactly, but Arizal saw someone, at that point you had a lot of ex-Moranos, Jews who had been in Spain and Portugal, who had been raised as Christian, but who knew they were Jewish to some extent. How much they knew, many of them were illiterate in Hebrew. They couldn't read Hebrew. That's the first time you actually start seeing books printed in Latin characters, in Spanish, and proper Spanish and Portuguese for Jews from that community who able to get out, move to Amsterdam. Amsterdam apparently had freedom of religion, and Jews were able to return to their Judaism in public, or they moved to other places. Some moved to Ottoman Empire, to the lands in the east. So even as far as Egypt, you had ex-Moranos who...
So the Arizal is in Egypt.
Arizal was in Egypt. Arizal's father was Ashkenazi. His mother was Sephardic. That itself is actually perhaps more relevant to his identity and what he was doing than you might necessarily think. Not everyone thinks back at that era in terms of these labels, Ashkenazic, Sephardic. Today, it's a little bit more common. It's person Ashkenazic or Sephardic, but if you're learning in yeshiva, you don't necessarily think too much about whether the author of a sefer of a book from 500 years ago was Ashkenazic or Sephardic, but it actually does matter very much. Those identities, those labels were very, in fact, perhaps more than now, because the geographic region where you grew up was very unique and different than somewhere 50 miles down the road, 100 miles down the road.
Right.
So that really shaped and influenced your knowledge, your sources of information, everything about you. So the Arizal's father was Ashkenazic. Luria is a very prominent Ashkenazi name. His mother was apparently Sephardic, and Eretz Yisrael in Israel, it was somewhat common, at least during certain periods, for Ashkenazim and Sephardim to marry each other. Another famous half Ashkenazi, half Sephardi is the Chida, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azalai.
Also, I'm actually a descendant of him.
Right, so there's a whole family in Yerushalayim, where also there was a descendant or an Azulai who identified as Sephardic, who then married Ashkenazim from White Russia, from Eastern Europe, and their descendants formed this whole family in Jerusalem till today. So that's another case of...
That's your family?
That's not I'm talking about...
Oh, my family.
Your family. Yeah. That family in Jerusalem that descend from Azulai. So there was this fellow named Azulai who married someone by the name of Yaffa from the White Russia, Eastern European immigration, early Hasidic immigration at that time. That's where this family descends from. But even before that, the Chida himself, his last name is Azulai, which is a Sephardic name, so his father was Sephardic, his mother was Ashkenazic, from different waves of migration of different Ashkenazim, Sephardim over the years. We're not getting into all these other historic
trying
chapters.
To figure out about
but
the
Arizal, so his father passed away. There's a whole story of how he was born. We're not going to get into that necessarily, but his mother apparently was Sephardic, or maybe even, I don't know, back then when you say Sephardic, there's a distinction between the diaspora from Spain, literally those who immigrated from Spain, versus the more Arabian Jews who were native to the Middle East from even before.
So when we say Sephardic,
Sephardim moved to, when a big portion of those Sephardim moved during the expulsion
You mean from the Spain? Sfard means Spain, right?
In Israel today, there's a distinction between Sephardi and Mizrahi. If someone identifies more as Arabian or from the Arabian lands, they'll use the term Mizrahi or Edot HaMizrach. That's the term that's used today. What happened was that in a lot of these lands, in Morocco, North Africa, or even in Syria and places like that, the Sephardim who showed up were more educated, perhaps they had more money, or they quickly earned more money, and so they sort of dominated the local communities and sort of shaped those communities to be more Sephardic in nature than they had been before. So that's the individual history of each of these communities. So it's not clear to me whether I don't know or whether anyone knows what exactly the exact heritage of the Arizal's mother was, but it seems that his mother's brother was someone of some importance in Egypt. He was the tax collector or something to that effect. So when his father passed away, they moved down to Egypt to be near this man of means who was a family member. And then the story goes that Arizal met, again, mentioning that you had these... First you had the first wave of expulsion, those who hadn't converted, who arrived in all these communities. Then you had further waves of Moranos who were raised as Christians and may or may not have known too much. So one such person showed up, seems more on business rather than local, and he had this manuscript. He came to Shul, he came to Center, he was looking at everyone was davening, everyone was praying, and he was just looking at this manuscript. Back then, of course, manuscripts were far more common, even though the printing press had been invented, but there were plenty of works, old and new, that were still in manuscript form. And he was staring at the manuscript, and Arizal, young man, went over and inquired, and it turned out the Morano was illiterate in Hebrew. He couldn't read, and he came to shul. He was tried to be a pious Jew to the extent that he could, but he couldn't actually keep up and participate in the prayers. So, but he had this manuscript, this sacred Hebrew manuscript that he had received somehow. It's been transmitted to him, I guess, back in Spain or Portugal, and he carried it around with him as this precious
Jewish
artifact. And Arizal looked at it and he realized, I think maybe it was the Zohar itself, or maybe a commentary on the Zohar. I think it was the Zohar itself. We'd have to check also the history of when the Zohar was printed. I don't know if the Zohar had been printed quite yet. I think it was printed somewhere around that time, which was its own chapter. So the Arizal wanted to get it from him. The guy didn't want to part with it. So I think the Arizal used his connections with his uncle, who was an important, like we mentioned, was an important figure in the finances in Egypt. So he pulled his connections to
get it,
to persuade this fellow to. I think maybe he offered him a good deal or something. Whatever the exact arrangement was, but he got this manuscript from him, and I think that's how he received the text of the Zohar, which hadn't been up until the printing press, up until it was printed. How many copies of the Zohar actually existed? How many manuscripts could there have been?
Right.
Think about how far a work could even be transmitted during that period of time, even if it's widely disseminated. What do we mean by that? What percentage of the population actually has it? Not that many. So someone like Arizal, he wouldn't have just have had access to a copy. So this was a revelation for him. He got this text of the Zohar, and then he spent years trying to decipher it, to work it out, and said that he used, again, he had resources, he had connections. He got this house. He was married already at this young age. He got this little house out in the woods, out in the middle of nowhere, maybe somewhere along the Nile River, and 6 out of the 7 days of the week, he'd spend there in isolation, just studying, and then he would have revelations from heaven in his dreams as to whether he was on the right track or he's not on the right track. So there are these details of how the Arizal acquired this greatness. But
so in other words, before this manuscript, Arizal wasn't a Kabbalist?
Yeah, so the Chaim Vital actually, his chief disciple actually mentions that he actually ran into the Arizal a few years earlier. The Arizal, it was very common for Jews in that area to sort of pop into Israel for a bit and then go back to Egypt, go back to Syria, go back to Lebanon. You see that a lot in the history of that time. You had people that maybe they owned the house there, they rented it out, they came, they left. So, or there were also around that time you start seeing, today people may be familiar with the going to Meron for Lag BaOmer. So this idea of heading. Trying to find there's a good word for it that I need to remember, but the idea of that there's a date, there's an event, and
everybody goes.
And we all gather around this particular site, usually a grave. Back in the day, there was a lot more celebration. Even Meron itself, today the whole Meron experience apparently is not what it used to be. But up until 50, 60 years ago, you would still see the very old-fashioned way of families that would sort of trek up and pitch a tent and roast a sheep, and there was a big family event.
Full-on festival.
A festival. There was a festival around Meron.
Interesting.
That was how it was practiced in the time of the Arizal. And in the time of the Arizal, actually, the rabbis seemed to look askance, look down on it. They didn't think it was necessarily very becoming. But the Arizal was the one who actually put it on the map as having spiritual significance. So the association you have today between Kabbalists or Hasidim and Meron or stuff like that actually seems to be a very direct result of something the Arizal chose to emphasize.
The Zohar was written by...
So the connection to Meron specifically is that you have the grave of Shemar Yochai, the author of the Zohar. So yeah, so that's why that one gets singled out in particular.
Saying that the
it's not
student
clear,
of the Arizal.
It's not clear whether the festival began for that reason. The people have looked into the origins of why people started going there. It may not have been understood as that. The Arizal may have also added these additional details as to the significance that he found. One of the Arizal's things was that he actually identified many sites across Eretz Yisrael, which he said were the burial spots of all kinds of ancient rabbis, and he himself would visit or send his disciples to visit and to sort of commune with the souls of those rabbis and thereby glean more heavenly information. So that was a big part of the emphasis in the Arizal's praxis, the things that he was actually practicing. Like I said, it's not just about it's not just about the teachings. It's about particular practices. So today, in Chabad, going to the Ohel is a very central part of what Chabad does. Many other Hasidic groups also, lately it's been picking up more and more. They'll go to Karistir, they'll go back to Eastern Europe, to the grave sites of different tzaddikim. to a certain extent, you can trace that back to the Arizal, identifying all of these sites of these.
So the Arizal is the
ancient
one that
Talmudic
started
rabbis.
this kind of tradition or culture of going to
The fact that it takes that this is a significant spiritual part of the practice for Hasidic Jews is certainly can be traced to the Arizal.
In other words, in Judaism, this wasn't really a thing before the times of the Arizal, to go to grave sites and...
Not with that emphasis of having spiritual significance. Like I said, it seems like there was a more populist things people did that wasn't necessarily seen as being
Connected
sublime and great and extremely important. The Arizal seemed to like pour
made it holy, made it a thing.
significance into it and put it on the map in the way. Still, you could say, still has evolved and morphed, or even Miron has changed in the last 50, 60 years what exactly the character of the time of the experience is. But that's something that was so that just to finish the point. Rabbi Vital said he met the Arizal a few years earlier before the Arizal was introduced and became the person that he became. He met him in Miron a few years earlier, and he says, I'm not sure at that time if he was a Kabbalist yet. He actually says like a line like that. Like, I'm not even sure if he was had reached the level that he reached. So implying that it could have happened fairly late, or at least reached its final form fairly late. And then when he finished learning what he had to learn, then he was instructed maybe from heaven to travel to Israel to find disciples there, or to find this disciple. And then he came to Tzfas, which was the big, new, up-and-coming, booming community of Spanish.
It wouldn't be fully wrong to say that the Arizal, till his mid-20s, wasn't a Kabbalist or wasn't exposed to much Kabbalah, and then suddenly he became a big Kabbalist. And
I think you'd have to look. I don't want to say with certainty without having, Ideally, I would have a computer here and we'd be fact-checking everything as we speak, because I think accuracy is very important. But for the sake of a conversation, we're going to have to make do with a rough approximation.
Maybe we'll get all the facts later.
But I do think it's interesting that other people from that circle, so the major Kabbalist in Tzfas, before the Arizal was Moshe Cordovero, nice Spanish name, and most people in Tzfas at that time were from Spanish backgrounds.
This is the main Kabbalist before the times of the Arizal?
Well, they overlap. When the Arizal arrived in Tzfas, Ramak, as he's known for short, was still alive, but he passed away shortly afterwards. There's a famous eulogy that the Arizal said about the Ramak. The Rebbe once said a whole sikha about that, sort of a famous sikha about how certain people weren't affected by the sin of the Garden of Eden, but that's a whole different discussion.
Right.
So there is some overlap there, and you look at the biography of the Arizal, and they'll touch at it about how the Ramak acknowledge him or not acknowledge him or whatever. But up until then, Ramak was the main Kabbalist in town. You had other Kabbalists. You have the L'Chodoidi that we say every Friday night. Was composed by Shlomo Al-Kabetz, who I think was more from the Ramak's circle, if I'm not mistaken. The fact that we say Kabbalah Shabbos, the fact that every single synagogue in the world, every shul in the world has this Kabbalah Shabbos, receiving the Shabbos Friday afternoon, Friday evening, is a direct contribution of the Kabbalists in Tzfas, meaning both the Ramak and the Arizal. It did not exist before the Ramak and the Arizal. The Ramak and the Arizal.
So there was no
circles.
Kabbalah Shabbos before then?
You showed up from Erev just like any other night. You'd have to, again, every single part has to sort of be examined separately,
right.
Because it's not just Kabbalah Shabbos. There are a lot of moving parts. So you would have
I'm imagining that the repetition after the Amidah was always there.
The bracha me'ein sheva, the condensed.
That's not a Kabbalistic introduction.
No, that's the Gemara. But
right.
Talking about, you look in your siddur. It says
you'll
see on top. It says Kabbalah Shabbos, L'chuna Ranana, L'chodoidi, all of that, and then it says Meir. Then you say Kegavna, which is a Hasidic addition to the siddur. And then you say Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu is the beginning of Meir. Every night, Baruch Hu is the beginning of Meir.
So would you say that there's a connection between the word Kabbalah Shabbos and Kabbalah?
That's an interesting thought, but I think it literally means receiving the Shabbos.
Right.
And the original form was you actually went out into the fields. The way certainly the Arizal did it is he prescribed it. You're supposed to go out into the field.
Kabbalah really means receiving, right?
Right. So you want to circle back to Kabbalah in general. Kabbalah in general, that's the term that's not the only term that's used. Some people use the word nister, which means concealed, or chachmas nister, the concealed wisdom. I'm not even sure. It'd be interesting to look through Sfarim and see how often they actually use the term Kabbalah versus how we just colloquially use it in conversation. I'm not even sure. It would be interesting to check what the balance is.
I think Kabbalah is generally
but it's certainly used in
to
Chabad
mean tradition,
in Chabad
right?
texts. It certainly will say Chachmei Kabbalah, Teres Kabbalah for sure.
Right.
The Kubbalim, as we mentioned,
Right.
those who Kabbalists are called Mekubalim. Yeah, so it seems to derive. I can't say for sure where offhand where the term originated and where.
In other words, how
steam.
that term associated with the secrets of the.
Right. I'm not sure if you went back to the 1300s whether that was the term they were using necessarily. You would have to. I'm sure it's been written about. I just don't know offhand. But yeah, it seems it's implying that this is like a secret, hidden, concealed tradition that's been received, that's been transmitted, and used to be only a select few would have known about it, and now it's. As time has gone on, like I mentioned before, with the printing press or with the Arizal coming along and his teachings and his disciples, and that's spreading, and then the Hasidic movement coming and spreading. So those are certainly a lot more in the open today.
So how do we get from a few individuals, studying this secret text, to where we are today? That we have, very young students. There's this thing that you shouldn't learn Kabbalah till the age of 40. How do we get today? We have very young students and teaching it to people who are, completely not associated necessarily even with Jewish tradition. How do we get from that to where we are today?
Right. So that moment of the Arizal seeing that manuscript that fellow was holding is actually a pretty key moment in the general history of the transmission of Kabbalah. Once he had learned whatever he learned, and he arrived in Israel, and the Ramak passed away, and he gathered this circle of disciples, and Reb Chaim Vital was the main disciple.
Was he by any chance older than him?
Reb Chaim Vital was older, and I just wanted to, that reminds me, I did want to mention one detail. You asked about whether the Arizal was, did it start at a young age or at an older age, and I did want to mention that the Ramak and Reb Chaim Vital, who were two big Kabbalists in that, before the Arizal and Reb Chaim Vital after the Arizal, but we find with both of them that they had some years in their late teens or early 20s where they were finding themselves. They were not. It's not like the biographies that you often are written today, where your life is sort of
wholly
scripted from age 5.
Right.
Ramak, it seems, just came from a random background and sort of got into Kabbalah in his early 20s, but within a year or two he had already written his magnum opus, the Pardes Rimonim, so he caught up very quickly. So that's it's a bit different maybe than...
this is the Ramak.
Yeah, this is the Ramak. Chaim Vital as well. He has a lot of autobiographical materials, and he also seems to imply that he had some years that he spoke to some kind of spiritualist. He used to go to a lot of different spiritual mediums and healers and beyond even the Jewish community, and he wrote down everything that they told him, and he always took a strong interest in his faith and what his mission in life is, his legacy. So I recall something there about how someone told him when he was pretty young that you're going to have a couple of years where you're not going to be sure which way you're going, and it can go either way, and then you're going to snap back into it, and you're going to go on this path. So it is interesting, I think, maybe even relatable or inspiring to see that back then it wasn't, today there's the yeshiva system. We live in a very different system today. Even today you have those who can, be on one path in their younger years and change paths. But the impression we get today is certainly that people are set on a path from a very young age, and here you see that those things were a lot more in flux. So Arizal doesn't say that he was ever not interested in important pursuits, but doesn't mean that he was anywhere near the level he achieved later. That's just So
it's interesting. So we have the Ramak, which is one of the prominent Kabbalists in Tzfas, and Reb Chaim Vital, and then the Arizal comes and kind of becomes the main Kabbalist, and then the Ramak is considered, the Reb Chaim Vital is considered his student.
Right, so if the Arizal hadn't showed up, Reb Chaim Vital would probably have been a very respectable Kabbalist in the traditional, whatever the tradition...
And he is just as a student of the Arizal.
At this point, though, he's just the mouthpiece of the Arizal. His most well-known works are all his transmitting the writings of the Arizal. I think I actually started mentioning before that the Shmoyne Sha'arim, the 8 gates, so that's Reb Chaim Vital had been writing and rewriting his... the teachings of the Arizal, and his final version of it was to divide it into eight sections, and each section is the gate. So that's the Shmoyne Sha'arim.
The Eitz Chaim was written by Reb Chaim Vital?
No, so Eitz Chaim is a compilation made by other people before Reb Chaim Vital's final version was released. There's a whole history there. As that, I mentioned that each passage in Arizal you'll often find in 4 different places. So there's the Eitz Chaim, there's the pre-Eitz Chaim, then there's the Shemona She'arim. So certainly, at the very least, you'll find every passage twice. Once in
Which is the most
Eitz Chaim.
respectable
So Eitz Chaim and pre-Eitz Chaim reached Europe sooner and were printed earlier. So let's say the Alter Rebbe, the early Chabad Rebbes, they were using Eitz Chaim and pre-Eitz Chaim and a few other works. The Shemona She'arim, which the Kabbalists in the Kabbalist circles prefer, was only printed in like the 1890s, I want to say, maybe a little earlier, so maybe the 1870s. So in Chabad history, the Rebbe Rashab would have been the first Rebbe to have had access to the Shemona She'arim. And you actually see that in the Rebbe Rashab's writings, he often revisited the Kabbalistic sources for the ideas that he was exploring. And you'll often, if you actually pay attention to the references, which many students don't, but if you did, you'll see he'll say, oh, Eitz Chaim says this and that. And then I checked the Shar HaKdamas, which is one of the Shemona She'arim, and in the Shar HaKdamas it actually says the wording is slightly different, and oh, this is significant, and
which one gets more, is more reliable?
So within Kabbalist circles, or even speaking for myself today, if I want to find a quote of the Arizal, I would first go to the Shemona She'arim because it just seems to be considered more accurate.
What is the Hasidic?
In terms of history, if you want to know where the Alter Rebbe is coming from, you would have to look at Eitz Chaim, pre-Eitz Chaim, because it's just a matter of researching the history of the transmission of these ideas. So
like the Mavi She'arim, right? It's different.
Mavi She'arim is something else.
That gets, so to speak, reliability whenever it's quoted in a reliable text.
If I recall correctly, Mavi She'arim is a more original work of Reb Chaim Vital. Reb Chaim Vital also had a period where, after he finished compiling the Arizal's teachings, he started writing original works like.
No, not the Mavi She'arim. I'm confusing with a different one. The one who describes, I think, the Lifnei Tzimtzum.
The Emek HaMelech.
Emek HaMelech, that one.
That gets to a whole other question of a whole other channel of the Arizal's teachings that's not through Chaim Vital. So we probably should get to that. I don't know if we should jump to that just yet. Maybe keep that thought, and let's get back to it. I just wanted to say about the Shemona She'arim that if you look at the Shemona She'arim, it actually is a very helpful way of categorizing, classifying what the Arizal's output was, because Shemona She'arim is divided. I don't know if I can rattle off all 8. One of them, let's say, is the Shar HaPsukim. So it's a whole work of all the interpretations of the Arizal to Psukim.
I think Shar HaKdamas is a very well-known.
Shar HaKdamas is the one you would probably be most familiar with. Shar HaKdamas is where he lays out all the new technical Kabbalistic ideas. So the details regarding Atzilus, details regarding the spheres, Partsufim, Tzimtzum. This would all be in Shar HaKdamas, but it's called Shar HaKdamas. Shar HaKdamas means these are the introductions you need to get to everything else I have to say. So technically speaking, if all you know is Shar HaKdamas, then do you really know the Arizal? Do you really understand what the Arizal is here to do? Not clear that the Arizal is here to teach us these, called Hakdamas. These are, maybe Chaim Vital called it. I can't say with certainty, but by calling it Hakdamas, it implies that this is like
introduction.
These are the introductions. You got to go through all this information to be able to understand what we're talking about, but that's not what we're talking about. And then you have Shar Psukim, so he'll interpret the Psukim. You have Shar HaMitzvahs, where he interprets the mitzvahs. You have Shar HaKavanos, or Shar HaTfilah, which is the intentions to have while davening, while praying. You have Shar Mamari HaZoyar, a whole section where he goes through interpreting the Zohar. So you can see that those were probably in greater likelihood the point, the object, the objective you were trying to get to, which is I want to be able to read a Zohar, I want to be able to perform mitzvahs with intentionality, I want to pray with the right Kabbalistic intentions. That was a big one. That was a major one. We can arguably say Hasidus came into being, maybe perhaps chiefly, primarily over interest people had in how to pray and how to pray with the right kavanas. Which sort of maybe gets somewhat forgotten in this day and age, but that was a big one at the time. There's Shar Ruach HaKodesh. That's a whole other Shar of the Shemona She'arim. That I believe Shar Ruach HaKodesh goes through, visiting the grave sites, things to do to that effect. How to work on your mind, how to work on yourself to be able to be a recipient for this greater knowledge, this greater spiritual revelation. So, Shar Ruach HaKodesh is probably a lot closer to what the Arizal saw himself as being here to transmit, rather than the Shara Akdamas. So that's an important point I'd like to emphasize.
So we want to figure out the culture that Kabbalah was bringing, the kind of like Hasidic following that Arizal had.
Right. So throughout, I want to emphasize this point, which is that the abstract, or the Hakdamas are very important, but they're all meant to lead to particular modes of practice, which could change from group to group. This is from the Kabbalists onward, the Arizal onward, Hasidus onward. Interestingly, today you look at the Hasidic world and you'll see Hasidic groups that almost don't focus and emphasize the Kabbalah at all. And that also has precedent. There were other groups of Hasidim that were described as Hasidim who were very devout, very pious, but perhaps they were very devout and pious in how they dressed, or in not being exposed to stuff they consider inappropriate.
The point is that the study of Kabbalah, like the whole evolution that is explained of how the world was created and all the mystical dimensions, and they're not necessarily, that's not necessarily what Kabbalah is all about. Kabbalah is really a style of life, how to live as a pious person and as a good person and connect and pray, and you can use those dimensions to further that and understand that and grow in that.
Right, 100%. In terms of Hakdamas, it seems, you could argue it's an eighth of the Arizal's Kabbalah. I don't know if you could really say that, because I'm sure Sharma Mari has Zohar. The interpretations of the Zohar are also somewhat in that realm, so maybe it's a quarter. However, I'm not going to give an exact number, but even in the Hasidic world as well, if you think about what Hasidus contributed, or what it means to be Hasidic, or Chabad particularly, studying what we call Seder Hishtalshalos, the Atzilus, Bria, Tzira, Asiya, spheres,
cosmic dimensions, the evolution of
what percentage of the output of Hasidus, what percentage of what it means to be a Hasid is that? It's an interesting question to think about.
Right.
I would say maybe it's 33% or 50%, or depends on the person, or depends on the era.
I'd say many people learning in yeshivas, learning Kabbalah, most people don't really understand or focus or get a full grasp of the whole evolution of cosmic realms as described in Kabbalah. They're even the focus. The focus of the teachers is more of like, how do you enhance your own life? How do you connect and become a better and more pious person?
Right. But it still depends, I think, individually on the age, or who the teacher is, and what they're excited about and what they want to talk about. Certainly, the formal classes in yeshiva focus more on the technical. But there are other extracurricular.
I would say that the majority of people that go through the system, they don't have a vision of exactly what Hishtalshalos looks like.
Right. Do you want to start critiquing or analyzing the system? Is that part of our scope here?
No.
Right. So, without
I'm pointing out that a big part of the study of Kabbalah is not necessarily the intellectual part of it. It's mostly the cultural and how we act and how we treat ourselves based off it.
Right, definitely. But there's often been this, almost, it's considered like an ongoing misconception that Chabad, in particular, let's say, is focused disproportionately just on the abstract intellectual stuff. So there's always like got to clarify so is there actually such a myth, or is the myth a myth? But it always seems to,
in comparison to other Jewish groups, definitely. But if you take a look into Chabad, you'll notice that it's not necessarily like that.
But from the Rebbe Rashab, you always hear this criticism of the people that focus too much. They're not applying it to themselves. They're just
focus too
stuck
much on the Haskalah.
Right, that would be the term that's
understanding
used the last few generations.
Right.
So there's always been this tension between how much of it is just the abstract, the intellectual exercise, versus what it's doing for you, how it's shaping your day-to-day life. So obviously, Chassidus shapes everyone's life, regardless if you go through the system, go through the yeshiva. The ideas, the hashkafas, that's the term we use, obviously shape a person. But the question is also even just the ongoing day-to-day. The Chassidus, you learned this today, you learned this week, you learned this month. What did that do for you in your actual personal engagement with God, engagement with bringing God into the world?
Right.
So this is an ongoing. It's not a straightforward. It's unresolved for many of us. It's something we're still trying to, as we go through life, we're still trying to find the right balance.
I'm going to close the window.
So this question of of how just there's the work-life balance. So there's the and you could say in the Kabbalistic world, the Hasidic world, there's the study-life balance of how much of it is study, how much of it is life, and how those interplay, what the interplay is between those two.
Let's get back to our first question.
Sure.
How do we evolve, culturally and intellectually from the Arizal to where we are today?
So to go back again to that moment of the Arizal seeing the manuscript, at that time Kabbalah was not, as I was saying, it was not
For the masses.
Something that the masses had access to. Certainly before the printing press was invented. The Arizal was already living in the mid 1500s, so the printing press had been invented for a while at this point, for about 100 years at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always fascinating to see what was printed immediately, what was printed within the first 20 years or 40 years or 50 years. Some of the classic stuff, some surprising stuff that's hasn't been reprinted since. It's always interesting to see. You're sort of coming straight out of the medieval era, so you had stuff that had been written 100 years ago, 200 years ago that was still fresh, that was people were still familiar with, and then now it's outdated. So you had these Kabbalistic works, particularly the Zohar, which is considered to be the main Kabbalistic work of all time,
Right.
No question. And there was this question of should it be printed or not. And there was actually a mini controversy. At that time, Italy was the seat of most Jewish works were being printed in Italy, arguably. And there was this big controversy in Italy. Italy also historically was very big on transmitting Kabbalah. And if we get to the question of the Emek HaMelech and the transmission of Italy is a very important channel for Kabbalah getting to Eastern Europe. Hasidus couldn't be Hasidus without that stop in Italy along the way. Also gets to the question you asked about 40 years, which I think, in short, I think there really were different communities that were taking different approaches at the time. And in a nutshell, in Poland, there were those who were pushing for the 40-year limit. In Italy, there was no, I think it's pretty clear, there was no 40-year limit. And in a certain sense, intellectually, we, in this aspect, in the aspect of Kabbalah, we are more a continuation of the tradition of Italy rather than the tradition of Poland. But
so before it was printed in Italy, there were already people learning it en masse?
So you would have to go back and pinpoint to see how widespread it was in Italy at the time and who the people were. I don't have the names and the dates offhand, but this is definitely where the push was coming from. The push to print it was coming from within Italy, and I assume that's not a coincidence. You see the great people in Poland at the time. Who was the great leader of Jewry in Poland at the time? Rabbi Israel's the Ramah, Shulchan Aruch. It's a very big name. He wasn't such a major fan of Kabbalah, and he certainly would have been. I don't know if he mentions the 40 years or people that came after him, but that's a more Polish response. There was more skepticism, there was more resistance, certainly for spreading it far and wide. Whereas in Italy, it seems there was much less of that. They were much more open to receiving these ideas. Italy was always just a very different place than the Eastern European countries we're familiar with. There was the Renaissance. There were a lot of other ideas. They were exposed to all kinds of other ideas, maybe even forms of mysticism.
So the Ramah, do we know if he learned Kabbalah or not?
There's definitely information on that. Would have to go refresh.
So the Ramah is he's a very influential rabbi till today in the Jewish community. Right?
For Eastern Europe, certainly for Eastern European Jews, which is most of the black hat Haredi world that we have today, are all Eastern European.
So, and he's the one that coded this 40-year cap?
I don't know if you would have to go look it's a Siman in Yeridea somewhere, what exactly the Ramah writes and what exactly the Shach adds in his commentary. But it definitely, maybe the Ramah mentions about or maybe even the Mechaber to some extent, or Ari Sephardi mentions you have to, the Mali Kreisoi, the Shas Upaiskim, you have to fill your belly with the classical Jewish Talmudic studies. There's definitely that tone there. And then I think maybe the Shach mentions a limit or something. But within the circle in Tzfas, within the circles in Italy, they had some restrictions. They probably only admitted people that they thought had the right character. I don't think they would teach it to anyone. But the ages of people involved are all very young, historically.
Right.
So true Kabbalistic circles, it seems historically, always admitted people who were young.
It was just an exclusive thing.
The emphasis on the age usually comes from circles that are not actually very Kabbalistic, but they're begrudgingly or acknowledging it, or they want to restrict it.
In other words, the Kabbalistic circles and mentors kind of knew who's going to be a good receptacle for these teachings.
Right. So, and that starts changing. You could say, it starts changing after the printing press, but also in the Hasidic movement, the rules or the lines of who it's appropriate to teach to maybe get a bit more blurred. And obviously, once the Rebbe Rashab opened the yeshiva, and now even the Rebbe Rashab's yeshiva was actually more exclusive, and he rejected people.
Right.
But once Judaism became built around the yeshiva, every community, the central organ, the central institution is the yeshiva, and everyone goes to yeshiva. So these are things that are always changing and shifting from decade to decade or from century to century. You can't just assume it's always been that way. So we'd have to go through century by century, or at least half century by half century, to see what the attitudes were to who it's appropriate to share with. But the printing press is definitely a very key moment here, in that up until the printing press, whatever percentage of people were
controlled by who knows it.
Right. So it would have been a very small percent. I can only make up numbers. 1%, 2%. What percentage of the Jewish population was literate or could literate on the level they could read advanced texts, and then who actually has an actual manuscript? Like if the Arizal hadn't met that guy, technically, maybe he never would have gotten a copy of Zohar. I don't know, it's hard.
Right.
How many Zohars were in Egypt in that decade? I don't know. Today you can probably go back. You have libraries that have a lot of old manuscripts, so you can actually go back and map the spread of certain works. You can say, okay, there's 2 manuscripts from Egypt, 5 from so you could go back and try to retroactively figure out how a certain work spread. That is possible to do.
So what did the printing press do?
So in Italy, they had this big controversy as to whether to print it or not. Also, to a certain extent, the printing press is what created the Zohar to a great extent, and that's because apparently, if you look at the manuscripts, apparently the Zohar in its form that we have today was not organized in that form in the manuscripts. Meaning the manuscripts each had portions. One manuscript may have had 20 pages, one manuscript had 50 pages, one manuscript had 100 pages. Not clear if they were in particular order. I guess I would have to spend the time myself and look at the manuscript myself to get a complete clarity on that. But it seems like the idea that the Zohar is divided according to the parsha, and it goes in this order. And then now today we can be betzayim. We could say, look at page 2, look at page 10, look at page 50. So the Talmud had always been organized. The Talmud, in every iteration that we are familiar with in the earliest times that we have it, it's
organized by page.
It's not the page, but
you're saying even before it was printed.
It's chapter, even before it was printed, the chapters, all the chapters were all exactly the way they are.
Right. Tractates, chapters.
There could be changes. Maybe things can be changed.
Right.
Like
the Zohar was like manuscripts, like booklets.
Zohar manuscripts. It seems like they were literally just every manuscript had stuff that the other manuscript didn't have, and the people who printed it had to gather as many manuscripts as possible, and then they sort of organized it in a certain way. And then even once they printed it, there were many sections and portions that they had missed. And it seems like the Arizal circle at some point maybe did have a printed version, but they also had they still used manuscripts because there were particular passages that there was a question as to what the accurate text is, or certain passages that were completely missing. And then they printed something called Zohar Chadash. So if you buy a set of Zohar, you'll see the Zohar and then the Zohar Chadash. Zohar Chadash was printed, I don't know, maybe 50 years later. And it's just a bunch of, again, it's like sort of in the order of the Parshias, but it's just sort of like the Hashmatas, things that. So if you look at Zohar, you'll see the Zohar Chadash, there's Hashmatas. Even in addition to that, there's something called Hashmatas Zohar.
So there were more and more manuscripts found, which were added as time.
And even till today, I think the academics who spend time with the Zohar have found additional passages that still haven't ever been printed properly, or different versions of certain passages. So it's a lot messier in that way. So even the Zohar as we know it was sort of, like I said, that's why I said it was sort of created in the printed press. Obviously, the text existed before. So it was a very pivotal, very important step for the Zohar. But the question was whether to print it or not. There was a big controversy in Italy, and there's a certain rabbi in Italy who's pretty obscure. A lot of obscure rabbis in Italy. Some are famous, some are obscure. A certain rabbi whose claim to fame till this very day is that every copy of Zohar that you open, you flip past the title page, there's a psak. It says, this is the halachic decision of Rabbi, I'm forgetting his first name, his last name was Dilatis. That's his last name. Maybe it's Yitzchak, I'm forgetting. But he wrote this whole psak about how the Zohar itself says that with this work we will leave Galus, which is a very famous
Right.
quote that's used to promote the push of the study of Zohar, the study of Kabbalah, of Hasidus. And he made the case. He went and laid out the case for spreading Zohar to the masses, meaning they were conscious of what this meant, and there was a big decision to be made, and he made the case that it should be done.
So this is after the Arizal's time.
It's around the same time. It's right before. I think the Arizal actually mentions his name to Reb Chaim Vital somewhere and says that this Rav had a very great schos that in his merit the Zohar was printed. So he actually gave him special credit for that. So you have to check the exact chronology when it was printed.
So the Arizal finds this manuscript of Kabbalah.
Sounds like there wasn't
quickly becomes a big Kabbalist, has time to write a letter to his disciple, which is apparently older than him and part of the club before him, about another rabbi who he's respecting because he had already printed the Zohar. So this all happened very fast.
There's a lot happening and changing around the same time. Right.
Wow.
So the spread of Kabbalah is probably like, you could say 50% the printing press and 50% the printing of the Zohar and 50% the Arizal. It certainly seemed to happen roughly around the same time, but the printing of the Zohar also increased the demand for interpretations of the Zohar. People want to understand what it's saying.
Right.
So the Arizal coming along and saying, here's the interpretation, I think also was so successful the way it was, in part because people were thirsty for anything that can make sense out of what the Zohar has to say. So it created a demand, and then Arizal immediately, pretty quickly met that demand. So, Arizal wouldn't be if not for Zohar. That's a given on multiple levels, both in terms of he needed to have a physical copy, he needed to interpret the Zohar, people wanted to get those interpretations. So without the Zohar, you don't have the Arizal, you don't have Hasidus, you don't have. But each, the Zohar, in terms of order of importance, it's the Zohar, the Arizal, and then Baal Shem Tov, Magid, Alter Rebbe. Those are three. That's why Lag BaOmer is. People go to Miron and Lag BaOmer. The way I see it, the way I understand it, what it's come to mean, is that it's a celebration of the Zohar and the Arizal. That's essentially what that day is. It's not necessarily what it meant before the Arizal showed up that first time in Miron, but that's what it came to mean. This is a celebration of Primi Esoteric, of the revelation of the Zohar and the Arizal, and that's how the Alter Rebbe spoke about it when he.
So how much time is there between the Arizal, the printing of the Zohar, which is in the same era, to the founders of the Hasidic movement?
So it's about 200 years.
200 years.
And in the interim, about 100 years afterwards, you have Shabtai Tzvi,
which is a big mess.
Which is a big negative event, but also a very important.
I think, would you say that that's a time in history where people started really reinforcing the negation of studying Kabbalah?
That's certainly reinforced that attitude in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Lithuania, in those particular lands. Once the Zohar was printed, it's very hard to control anyone can get it. It's still probably expensive, or not a very impoverished person probably still can't get it, but someone of means who's interested in something more can certainly get a hold of one. So that certainly brought it to a tremendous number of people, and the rabbis in Poland weren't necessarily thrilled about it.
Should we talk a little bit about the Shabtai Tzvi episode? I
don't want to get too deep into it, but it was this messianic movement, and messianic would be literally like, he's coming in a year or two. There was an expectation that it's all about to wrap up.
This was a Kabbalistic...
but it was all very Kabbalistically fueled. And Shabtai Tzvi's main lieutenant, Nassan of Gaza, Nassan Ha'azati, was otherwise known to be a very devout scholar of Kabbalah, meaning he had a reputation regardless as a very devout person and a very big scholar of Kabbalah. So, and specifically of the Arizal's Kabbalah. So by putting his name to it, Shabtai Tzvi wasn't necessarily known as a scholar per se. There's, people debate whether he even was familiar with Arizal's Kabbalah or he only knew Zohar. But Nassan Aza was more of a conventional Kabbalist in the way we imagine one post Arizal, and very a big name, very influential. So by putting his name to it, he was sort of giving the stamp of almost the Arizal's approval. Like, the Lurianic, the Arizal Kabbalists are acknowledging that this is...
Did he remove that stamp later?
No, what ended up happening was the Shamsi was ultimately imprisoned by the Ottoman Sultan and ultimately forced to convert to Islam, which he did. After which, in the subsequent decades, a certain percentage of his adherents and followers also converted to Islam, and you had a group in Turkey till 100 years ago who actively kept this tradition and
Kabbalistic tradition.
yeah, well, yeah, Jewish, Islamic, Kabbalistic, Sabbatian tradition, yes. And they have writings, they have, in whatever, I think they continue speaking Ladino, the Jewish Spanish dialect. Um, I think there's still some trace of that. I don't think there's like a from version of them. I don't think there's any religious ongoing activities.
Religious Muslims. Or religious
No,
Kabbalistic Muslims.
I mean the Jewish part, yeah, the Kabbalistic.
Their conversion to Islam meant they
I think
dropped
if you live in
Judaism.
Turkey, I think you might still say, "Oh, that family, these people, their descendants." You would still be able to point at people, and although sometimes there are conspiracy theories also, so you have to differentiate between the fact and the fiction. Anyone in Turkey who doesn't like Erdogan can say, "Oh, he's from," you could just say whatever you want, but
Right.
you'd have to actually prove that you know what you're talking about.
Right.
So that's its own interesting break off. But Nasser al-Azhar did not convert to Islam. And in terms of what's relevant to us is that there was a very large group of Jews who continued being adherents of Shabbat Tzvi in some sense. What that meant exactly could mean different things for different people. There also were certain schools of teachings that weren't all tied directly to Shabbat Tzvi is coming to redeem us, but teachings about the nature of Seder Shtalshus, of God's interaction with the world. There were new ideas that came along with that whole group that were very attractive to people and very influential for the next 100, 200 years. And maybe that's technically what's most relevant to Hasidus coming along, and there being suspicion about there being some potential link or not. But Nasser al-Azhar continued being a very pious Jew. Some communities maybe kicked him out when he would show up, and some communities didn't. He seems to have been respected by the general Jewish population.
How is he viewed today?
So within the Eastern European, the Polish, Lithuanian, Russian world, so he's, I think, pretty much considered to be an evil person, just like Shabbat Tzvi. Within the more Sephardic world, Shabbat Tzvi and Nasan were never ever fully outright condemned. Even Shabbat Tzvi, the policy was we don't talk about him. We don't say good or bad. That was their policy. So they wouldn't say, Shabbat Tzvi Machshmai. They wouldn't
Is there a Chabad policy?
Pretty much the same as anyone else. I don't think there's any unique. I mean, there's something with the Baal Shem Tov and Shifchei Baal Shem Tov about how there was a spark of Mashiach in Shabbat Tzvi and something went wrong. So it's acknowledging that there was something there, there was something to it, but it went horribly wrong. Nasser al-Azhar was even more respected. He had that existing reputation regardless. You could even ignore it if you wanted. You could ignore his Shabbat Tzvi part and just say, he's a great guy.
Right.
So yeah, it's interesting that it's not black and white. Certainly in that part of the world, it wasn't seen as being black and white. Were we getting at a particular point?
We're trying to figure out what happened between the Arizal's era and the Hasidic.
Right. So I think you're also asking specifically about the attitude, what the attitude was, what was the reaction to it. So in Eastern Europe, which is most relevant to us, coming from the Hasidic world, even though this is pre-Hasidic, the Hasidic movement that we usually call the Hasidic movement, there were a lot of adherents of Shabbat Tzvi, it seems, in the 50 years or so afterwards, and it wasn't necessarily, people weren't necessarily fighting it or going after it. This is my understanding, it's my interpretation of what happened then. What happened later was that a new group called the Frankists then emerged, and they seem to have way more twisted teachings and behaviors. They were accused of conducting very immoral rituals. So when that broke, that was a big scandal. That scandalized everybody. And then I think that brought people to re-examine the Shabbat Tzvi episode. And I think that's when the very strong narratives we're all familiar with. Shabbat Tzvi was an evil man, and then the Frankists are his continuers, his followers, and they're also evil. And now we look back and we have a very black and white picture of what happened. I think that narrative was shaped a bunch of decades later in response to that. and you see certain halachic writings from that time where they're like, oh, the guy in our town, we always knew he was an adherent of Shabbat Tzvi, but we didn't care about it. Now the Frankist thing happened, so like, he wrote all the Sifrei Torah for our shows. Like, do we have to throw out the Sifrei Torah? They're trying to figure out what to do about it.
Wow.
So I think you see very clearly in these cases where they're retroactively say, well, oh, Shabbat Tzvi has been bad all along. This is after he converted and after he died, but there was more tolerance of it.
Right.
That's my understanding. But once things like the Frankists came along, so then the opposition got very, very rabid. You have people like Rabbi Yaakov Emden and other Sabbatian hunters that were really just agitating about it nonstop. You had books, the biography of Shabtai Tzvi, describing him in very evil terms, was printed around that time. So that's when that I think was a bigger backlash. That the Frankists caused a bigger backlash, and that's when Kabbalah in general would have been once again those old attitudes of 40 years, or we shouldn't really be allowing. I don't think that 40-year limit had been necessarily observed in the time in the interim, but
this is when
in general when you have these takanas, haramis, rules, it's not clear necessarily how strongly they're actually observed. So
right.
rabbis can say 40 years.
Right.
Is that being observed?
Right.
We don't know. If 70 years later someone comes and says, oh, we should keep the 40-year thing. So on the one hand, they're referring back to that. On the other hand, they're renewing it. It doesn't mean that it was.
Right.
So it seems like that strengthened that camp. You look in the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote Sefer HaZecharinos. Sefer HaZecharinos, to a great extent, is shaped around this narrative of the two camps. If you actually go read it as a historic narrative, I don't know how, often kids read it at a very young age where they're not necessarily ripe enough to fully appreciate it. They just see it as like many individual stories or whatever people take away from it. But one larger thing you can take away from it is that the Frierdiker Rebbe is rewinding 200 years before Hasidus and saying there were two camps. Even in Eastern Europe, there were those who were opposed to Kabbalah, and they seem to be the mainstream. And then you had those, even in Eastern Europe, who were pro-Kabbalah, and so which he describes as Nestorim, this hidden movement, this hidden mystical movement that predates Chassidus and lays the ground for Chassidus. So a lot of people come away with that takeaway about the Nestorim and the pre-Chassidus, but part of what that's all coming to say is, obviously Chassidus was met with a very hostile reaction when it emerged. Right. Why was that? What was happening? So there's context for that, and some of it is even older, just skepticism about spreading Kabbalah and mysticism, and some of it was recent memory of Shabtai Tzvi and Frankists, and we're not doing this again. That was, some people's attitude.
So are the Kabbalists in this era, let's say between the Shabtai Tzvi and the Baal Shem Tov, do we know who they are? Do we know what kind of practices they involved?
So the Frierdiker Rebbe has like this chain of Baal Shems, Rabbi Baal Shem, Rabbi Baal Shem, other Baal Shem, the Baal Shem Tov. We don't necessarily know that much about each of them, or
do we have mention of
or what we do know about them doesn't necessarily link them. So
do we have any mention of these individuals from in other places?
Yeah, so there's certainly at least one person, if not more, who are known as Rabbi Baal Shem. There was Rabbi Baal Shem of Worms who printed different works. Rabbi Baal Shem was known. Now the term Baal Shem, specifically, interestingly, in the Eastern European context, really meant more someone who was like a faith healer. Or who engaged in healing, and maybe they wrote amulets, kameas, or stuff like that. Rabbi Baal Shem, actually, he had a grandson, I think, also known as Rabbi Baal Shem. So I'm not sure when we say Rabbi Baal Shem, which one we mean.
Which one?
But one of them printed a work of like these types of, like, in case of illness, in case of this issue, this is, take these ingredients, that kind of stuff. So that was the more narrow sense of what Baal Shem meant.
And they were considered Kabbalists?
So now these are sort of somewhat related fields, but you can, even from Chaim Vital, for example, we have other writings of his where he also was interested in
healing,
in healing and stuff like this. He has a sefer called Sefer HaPa'ulis, where his whole life he was always researching every book that had these recipes. It's not just recipes; it could be in the academic term for it is magic, essentially, where you're following particular formulas to achieve certain results that are not scientific in nature. So Chaim Vital was always, in his book, I think he divides it between the ones that I tried and worked, the ones that I tried and didn't work, proven and unproven. So he was actively researching and experimenting. So there is, and the Friedrich Rebbe also touches on that a bit. He distinguishes between what he calls Kabbalah Yunis and Kabbalah Mysis. Until today, you have this term Kabbalah Mysis, that's a term people will throw around.
So what are these two terms?
Kabbalah Mysis is used to mean practical Kabbalah. So that would be writing amulets or doing other formulas that are meant to achieve certain results. Versus Kabbalah Yunis, which is more Arizal, studying Seder Shtalshalos or Zohar or whatever that is. Zohar, Arizal, they're not overtly magical Kabbalah Mysis in nature. But there's often a connection. There's often a relation between those areas. They can overlap a lot, but it is possible to just be one, not the other. So you could just be a Baal Shem who maybe can't learn and can't read, but you got a book from your grandfather. You know how to.
So these are the people who kind of like brought, past the tradition of Kabbalah.
So someone who's a Baal Shem is already probably more likely in that corner where if they are intelligently inclined, they are more likely.
Are there any Kabbalistic writings, known writings from this era, in the 100 years before the Baal Shem Tov?
Certainly are, and some of them are accused of containing subbation hints or allusions, and that itself makes things exciting for those who find that exciting. There always were. Once the Zohar was printed, you can find in any locale, there were always some who were studying the Zohar or writing commentaries on the Zohar. Once the Arizal stuff.
There's no big famous ones.
A name that you would know from Eastern Europe from the 1600s who's a Kabbalist, nothing that springs immediately to mind that's famous.
Maybe Sephardic? There seems to be like a separate Sephardic Kabbalistic.
Italy would be the place to, like I mentioned before, Italy is also a very important link and the roots to Eastern Europe. So Ramesh Zakudo wrote a commentary on Ramaz for short, wrote a commentary on the Zohar. He lived in the 1600s. He lived through Shabtai Tzvi. A lot of these Kabbalists actually had to work out there what they felt about what was going on. So Ramaz is quoted in Hasidus all the time.
Right.
If you pay attention to the references, you have Rabbi Manuel Chayriki who wrote the Mishnas Chasidim. That was also Mishnas Chasidim is quoted a lot. So he was Masader certain parts of the Arizal's teachings, looking his own Seder with his own additions.
Where was he in history?
They're all in the 1600s. So those are some names that if a semi-serious student of Hasidus should be familiar with.
Right.
And then you have other names that are somewhat less famous. But Italy was certainly a big place for it for sure. But there were other channels, other even works that are not necessarily well known anymore that were well known in the 1700s. If you look back at what the people in the 1700s were learning, or even the Hasidic works, what they quote, you'll see certain works that are perhaps forgotten today. So there's always a lot going on, and you can zoom in on the micro and individuals, or zoom out.
You know who wrote the Shefatal? Like where that was?
Right, for example, of course, Shalah. That's certainly a major one. Shalah is, I don't know if he counts as Eastern Europe. I have to go check his exact
Shefatal was written by the Shalah?
Shefatal, I think. Is that his father? I think they're related, or there's a connection there. I would have to go refresh the details on that. So Shalah certainly, which that's the association I have when you say Shefatal. The Shalah is certainly a very important link.
When did he live? Also?
1600s. The story goes that the year the Shalah was printed, that was Tachvatat. That was the year that Khmelnytsky, the Ukrainians, massacred Jews in Ukraine, in that region. And the idea was that Shalah was a big revelation, and the big revelation also brings with it negative, can also bring with it negative events. The Alter Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe describes the Alter Rebbe pre-Hasidus as being a Shalah Yid. So if you were a younger man, you were a young man, and you were interested in being more pious and devout and spiritual and following Kabbalistic teachings, Shalah would have been a very influential work. Shalah is, I should spend more time studying it, but at least parts of the Shalah is literally written as a guide of how to go through Jewish life in a devout Kabbalistic way. So he has Maseches Chulin. He has terms used like Talmudic terms, Maseches Chulin, Maseches Shabbos. But what's Maseches Chulin? Maseches Chulin is how to go through the week in a spiritual, intentional way. Masechah Shabbos is how to go through Shabbos, how to start from Friday. That your whole Friday is like scripted. You go through Friday, the Shnai Mikveh Targum, the Mikveh, all these things. They're not just like random stuff that you have to check off a list. It's like it builds up.
Reishis Chachma is also kind of like that?
Reishis Chachma is from the Tzfas, is from the Tzfas
Earlier?
circle. No, but right afterwards, yes.
Right after the
it's also an influential, yeah. You have Reishis Chachma is a bit more. There's a genre of Musar Sfarim. So there's Musar Sefer is, well, there's different genres, there's different categories of Musar Sefer as well. Musar Sefer is sort of more overtly sort of hyping you or I don't know, threatening you into being a more devout person. There's different ways you could do that. So Reishis Chachma brings a lot of Zohar and a lot of even I think Arizal teachings that are relevant to that.
Right.
And so that was influential as well. In Poland, you had Kav HaYashar. Kav HaYashar was also very influential, more, but they're a little bit more plain-spoken. They're a little bit more meant for mass consumption.
Right.
Kav HaYashar was also very influential in that way. And they also had Kabbalistic ideas. You had Yesod V'Shoresh Avodah, I believe is what it's called. That's like in Lithuania, like right before Hasidus. It's like a Lithuanian flavored, like you could see what someone who didn't receive the Baal Shem Tov, but is like thinking along similar lines on the same track, which is to say, Baal Shem Tov didn't invent something out of whole cloth. There were trends, and he was building on those trends, and then you had people that were like just outside that group who were thinking in similar directions, and sometimes he's considered an honorary chassid, even though he wasn't a chassid, because he had similar ideas or emphasized similar things. These are all interconnected and are all playing a role. And like I said, it's not just the intellectual ideas; it's the practice and the idea.
How would you summarize the evolution of the practice and the culture from the Arizal to where we are today?
It's a good question. Ultimately, we're all familiar with a version of Judaism that's like as plain as vanilla as possible, where it's just you go to shul in the morning, you go to shul afternoon. Nowadays, it also means you send your kid to yeshiva. That's maybe the chief element of Judaism for whether you're Orthodox or not. And so that's a version of Judaism that's always existed.
Right.
And some people, that's their comfort zone. They're very happy with that. Today in America, that usually means how much non-Jewish influence are you allowing into your house? How much sports? How much TV? Etc. But usually it leaves a lot of if you literally have just are keeping the basics, that leaves a lot of space for a lot of other stuff to come fill the void. You also have the Yeshivish world, which is, you could say, a continuation of that Polish-Lithuanian strain of we are devout in certain ways, but we don't have any overt Kabbalistic influence. So there is a version of that still exists, and they elevate Gemara, studying Gemara, to the center of Judaism. So that's their version of Judaism. Obviously, it is somewhat or very appealing to a large swath of people. And they present themselves as being, the leading intellectuals of the Jewish Talmudic world. So that is another option, or there's the subcategory of those who are very into halacha, how to apply the minutia of how to Jewish practice. You're building a sukkah, and every detail of how to put the walls up and the schach. Getting very caught up on the details of that. That's like a subcategory of that. But for the last however long you want to trace Kabbalah back for, you have circles, groups of people that are seeking to be more pious, more devout, more spiritual. There should be a greater spiritual dimension. Until today, Chabad, people within Chabad that are seeking to spread Chabad Hasidus often do very well among people who feel that like their Judaism is lacking. There's something. Why am I doing this? Why am I getting up in the morning? I never miss a minyan. I never. But why? I don't feel it. It's not making me feel anything. So in very dry terms, it's to try to have a more experiential Judaism where you feel like you're communing with the divine. There's a divine how you can take that. There are many levels of that, right? So you could say Chabad or version of Chabad. It's like a very radical version of Einod Milvadai, the emphasis of like nothing is outside of God. So I don't want to just downplay. This is a very radical or intense version of that, but that's not how it's experienced by everybody. But the minimum, the tzad hashava, the element that is supposed to be there for everybody to some extent, is that there is an experiential, more spiritual feeling to it. In the rest of the Hasidic world, which isn't very intellectual, it's like purely vibes and aesthetics and experience, and so it's the gathering at the tish and singing, and even though the yeshivish world is actually slowly bringing singing and kumzitzes, and which is a pretty Hasidic influence. Even avarim davening, going into shul and davening with warmth, is seemingly a Hasidic invention. I was observing recently. You go to Lakewood, you go to places, and you see people that are davening avarim davening. Maybe it's controversial to suggest this, but I think that itself is Hasidic influence. So you go they're davening the old Ashkenaz, the old no overt Hasidic influence, but the manner of davening is a Hasidic manner of davening. That's not to say that there weren't other non-Hasidim pious Jews who may have also had avarim davening, but like the average Rosh Yeshiva 100 years ago, my impression is that they weren't known for davening with energy, with their entire body. Kolatz moisai taimarna, you're davening with your entire body. So there are a lot of more external, and some of that could be very beautiful and meaningful for many people. So that's like that's the most watered down version of it, where there's no, the Kabbalah part is mostly gone, or maybe there's a certain, the Reishis Chachma version of Kabbalah of just like the harm one does to oneself when one commits a sin is so deep and so cosmic. So the ideas like that, but without any specifics. So you always have to be, you have to analyze where each idea comes from. So mention Reishis Chachma, that's a very powerful contribution. Where if someone sometimes it has a downside where someone who sins feels, if they just were, plain vanilla Orthodox and they sinned, okay, whatever, big deal. But, now that it's, Kabbalah says that it's the worst thing ever, and now I feel horrible, then you have to sort of, put those people back together and figure out how to reframe it so they don't feel so terrible. It's not being helpful, it's being harmful. It's ultimately supposed to be helpful. It's supposed to give you the right perspective and help you. It's supposed to strengthen your observance. Not cause despair and hopelessness. But Chabad, then you have the Shiva Summit Kabbalah. It's not really something we encounter here in America, but in Yerushalayim, you still have circles that consider themselves to be like almost a direct continuation of the Arizal, like they're still studying the Arizal's teachings as he taught them, as his students.
And they're like Sephardic, or?
So certainly, to some extent, many of the big names in the last 200 years are Sephardic, but there have always been some Ashkenazim. Now I think there are multiple yeshivas, and each one has their version of it, their flavor of it.
And are they studying Hishtalshelus?
Yeah, so it seems like my impression is that like for them it's like, I don't know, 50% just studying the very like the Shar HaKdamas, just the technicalities, but a big part of it is the kavanas. So when you're davening, when you're praying, you're thinking these very intricate technical thoughts about the spheres and how each word that you're saying is causing this and that. That was a big contribution of the Arizal. Like how to daven.
So that's what these people are doing.
Yeah. So and you go to the Jewish the farm stores like in Borough Park, you'll see there's a tremendous boom of pure Kabbalistic stuff being printed, including kavanas. And people are now with computer graphics, you can create new modalities of how to convey the kavanas. So I've seen 3D models of the kavanas. There's all kinds of stuff going on. In Chabad, I think we're conditioned to, that's like one part of Kabbalah that we're sort of conditioned to not think about, which is itself an interesting conversation, the history of how to daven and the Kavanas, and then where Hasidus came in and where Chabad came in. But it just came up in conversation today. The Rebbe had a proper Siddur HaArizal. When we say Siddur HaArizal, we mean a Siddur with all the Kavanas in it, which could be 500-700 pages. The Rebbe had a Siddur HaArizal that he would use on special occasions. So he would use it for Tkiyas. He would blow the shofar Rosh Hashanah. The Rebbe would bring his Siddur HaArizal, and it's an Eastern European version of it. The Arizal didn't produce a Siddur, so other people had to produce a Siddur based on the Arizal's teachings. So there are multiple Eastern European ones in the time of the Baal Shem Tov. So there's the Siddur of Shabse, there's the Siddur of Usher. The Rebbe would bring the Siddur of Shabse, and I think someone mentioned that by the Seder as well. The Rebbe may have had it. The Rebbe used it for certain special occasions, so it's not completely gone. It's there in the background. Even in the Alter Rebbe, the Chabad Siddur that we use has like 10, 15 places where there are kavanas. There are these little, the most famous one that everyone would be familiar with is Sphira. You look at the Sphira in the Siddur, and next to every single Sphira, next to every number, there's a bunch of stuff that you're supposed to maybe say, maybe think about. No one really thinks about thinking about it, but it's there. That's the most overt Kabbalistic Kavana part of the city, you could say.
You know where like people like the Baba Sali, like where they come from?
Baba Sali is from Morocco. I think in Morocco specifically, he seems to be from the more Arabian part of Morocco. Like I mentioned before, the Spanish expats, so they came and took over a lot of communities and sort of imposed their way of doing things. But so Morocco had the more Spanish parts and had the less Spanish parts. Baba Sali came from a part of Morocco where they still practiced polygamy. They still married more than one wife, which is pretty rare. Even in the Ashkenazi have the Chem de Brina Gershom, where it's like it's banned. The Sephardim never banned it, but like every ksuba, like when the people would get married, the marriage contract would have a clause that you can't marry another wife. That was how they basically. But you had at the edges, like in Iraq, certain like the edges, like in the more Arabian parts of that world, you still had polygamy. And Baba Sali.
So do we know how like what that Kabbalistic chain is?
So there was a chain. So the Kabbalah, though, obviously came through Spanish channels. The Zohar itself was revealed in Spain, and the early Kabbalists were from Spain. We didn't get into all that, but even the Kabbalists in Sfas were Spanish. So
Right.
or the Arizal's mother's side, assuming that they were Sephardic. So certainly the original up until the 1500s was Spanish. Then you said Italian and other places,
Right.
but. Thinking about it geographically is very important and helpful for understanding how things work.
Right.
What was I saying? So so Morocco, obviously whatever Kabbalah reached Morocco was through Spanish channels, but if you actually start if you actually take an interest in other Jewish groups, you'll find there are all kinds of Kabbalists and Kabbalistic works being printed or being written in Morocco. Recently, I've come across that apparently someone in Morocco, maybe 400 years ago, wrote a full commentary on the entire Zohar, like a somewhat readable commentary. There aren't that many of those. Today you have modern commentaries on the Zohar that are trying to make it readable to your average person. So someone in Morocco did something like that and was never printed till the last 20, 30 years. So like I was saying, there's a big boom in Kabbalistic works and stuff in manuscript that was never printed is being printed. A lot going on. There's definitely huge demand for that. Oh, so I think I was summarizing, but Hasidus Chabad is a balance of those things. There's a lot more of the intellectual. There's certainly the studying the Arizal's teachings or a version of that of Seder Shtalshus, Atzilus, Bri Yitzir Asiya, and beyond. There is some tradition about davening and how to daven, although that itself requires its own discussion. Davening in Chabad. So the Kabbalistic roots of the Hasidic movement are certainly most visible within Chabad, but you could also you could take Chabad and take the yeshivas and the Kabbalah, and I compare them more often than most do, and I consider them to be like second cousins of each other intellectually, and sometimes it's relevant because you have questions about practice, like according to the Arizal, how should we do X, Y, and Z, and maybe Chabad sources don't say it, but if you check what Kabbalist circles say about it, that would actually be informative and helpful to understand how we think about it as well. It just wasn't articulated. So you could see certain similarities where we are working with a similar set of original texts, Arizal's teachings, but obviously what we're focusing on. Also, Chabad Alter Rebbe taught so many original ideas based on the Arizal's teachings that the Alter Rebbe, even though in Chabad terms it's Shem B'Yechai, the Arizal and Alter Rebbe, each one's contribution is so massive, and we see everything through the Alter Rebbe's lens, and then the Zohar part really fades away, and even the Arizal part sort of fades out of view a bit, although so much of the terminology is still coming from there. But even basic term we use, mamali, soiviv, these are all terms the Alter Rebbe introduced. I actually saw recently that Rebbe Rashab was actually struggling a bit somewhere where the Arizal never used the word Seviv. The Arizal has igulim, and the way the Alter Rebbe teaches Seviv is that Seviv is there's no up and down. It's mamale. There's ups and down. All the ups and downs. You say this is higher, this is lower. That's mamale. Seviv is by definition it's equal everywhere. But if you look in the Arizal says that igulim is lamaila, there's lamata, and Rebbe Rashab, so this is an example of Rebbe Rashab going back to the sources and saying, hey, wait a second. In the Arizal's model, there seems to be an up and down in the Igulim as well. But the Alter Rebbe said he says so. To explain the Kabbalah al Hasidus, you can see that he's
working it out,
revisiting, and he gives his whole hasber on whole explanation as to how he understands that there is an up and down, but it's not the same kind of up and down. It's a totally different kind of up and down. And he says there's a very famous passage there, which people are more familiar with. I don't know if we're going to get into that. So. Hasidus is best understood through the lens of understanding Zohar, the Arizal, these different movements, different directions that people went in. So I don't know how you framed your question about summarizing, but that's a summary in some sense. But everything Chabad Chassidim do, whether they're conscious of it or not, the siddur that we daven from is Alpi Nusach Arizal, whether or not that's, the Arizal didn't write any siddur, but it's the Alter Rebbe's interpretation of how the Arizal would want a siddur to be written, right? So I would still call it more the Alter Rebbe siddur than the Arizal siddur, but the Alter Rebbe's premise was we need a daven according to the way the Arizal said to daven.
Right.
So until today, every Chabad siddur says on the front page, Alpi Nusach Arizal, like that's the advertisement, right? So at that time, that was the big catch. It's like, we're going to teach you how to study the Arizal correctly, how to study the Arizal properly. Just because you have Arizal's works doesn't mean you understand them or know how to apply them. We're gonna teach you how to do that. So it's everywhere. It penetrates everywhere throughout the Chabad teachings, whether you're fully aware, conscious, or you need to take the time to trace it, but it's there.